Good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you all to the Lorne Gales Lecture in the History of Science, presented by the Mossman Endowment and supported by the Friends of McGill University. My name is Martin Morris, and I'm speaking briefly on behalf of the library. I am a life sciences liaison librarian, mainly working in the field of dentistry, but I also look after Indigenous health, pathology, geriatric health, and LGBTQ+ health. We're live today from the Otto Maas building on McGill University campus, and I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly recognise that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which people of the world now gather. The legacy of Dr. Donald Mossman lives on at McGill, both through the lecture series he founded to further the understanding of science and in the collection of donated books on the history of science and ideas. Dr. Mossman was born in Montreal in 1898. He studied chemistry at McGill in the 1920s, and although he went on to graduate degrees elsewhere and subsequently taught chemistry at Hunter College in New York, his allegiance and his heart were always with McGill, his first alma mater. In 1974, he and his wife Dorothea Mossman donated their entire collection to the McGill University Library. These 1,700 books can now be found in the Schulich Library of Physical Sciences, Life Sciences and Engineering. Their generosity did not stop there. In 1982, a further donation was made by the Mossmans to maintain and further develop the Mossman collection and to encourage research and teaching in the history of science and of ideas. With this endowment and a later bequest, Dr. Mossman also established two named lectures named in honour of his two great McGill friends, Elizabeth B. McNabb, and today's lecture, the D. Lorne Gales Lecture. Today's talk, as I've said, is the D. Lorne Gales Lecture in the History of Science. The lecture celebrates the love of learning and the friendship of D. Lorne Gales and Donald D. Mossman. D. Lorne Gales was the founder of the McGill Development Office and a member of the original McGill University Rowing Club, circa 1930. Gales was also deeply involved with McGill for over 63 years, from his student-athlete days through his role as General Secretary of the Graduate Society. We pay homage to his outstanding contributions here today. I would like to end with a quote from Mossman that encapsulates his vision for interdisciplinarity. The study of the history of science alone may suffer a degree of cultural barrenness, similar to that of many other scholarly studies, if no attempt is made to relate it to the climate of opinion in other disciplines existing during the period studied. For there can be no doubt that religious, philosophic, and political beliefs and social attitudes have all frequently affected one another, and that there have been mutual influences between these and the progress of science. This view strongly suggests the wisdom of a rather eclectic approach to the history of science. This we deem highly desirable. I have no doubt that today's lecture will honour Dr. Mossman's vision. I'd like to introduce now Professor Michael Nicholson, who will give us a few words about today's lecturer, Professor Morgan. Professor Nicholson.
And thanks so much, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Nicholson. I'm a professor in the English department at McGill University. And before I introduce our speaker, our distinguished guest, I would like to mention that following Professor Morgan's lecture, there will be a Q&A period, which I will moderate. You can send in the questions during the lecture by emailing them to info.library@mcgill.ca, or if you're in the audience, you can ask them live. We will try our best to get to all of your questions. I'm thrilled to introduce Professor Benjamin Morgan to you today. Benjamin Morgan is Associate Professor of English, Language, and Literature at the University of Chicago. His main areas of research include 19th century British literature and science, and the environmental humanities. His first book, The Outward Mind, Materialist Aesthetics in Victorian Science and Literature, explores how early scientific studies of the human mind transformed ideas about the human experience of the arts. His current book project, In Human Scale, The Aesthetics of Climate Change, traces how literature and the visual arts have developed formal strategies for depicting large-scale ecological systems since the early industrial moment of the climate change era. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Morgan to the stage.
Thank you, Professor Nicholson, so much for that introduction. I also wanted to start by thanking the McGill University Library for the very generous invitation to come speak, and to the people who've helped facilitate this visit, Marika Raimundo and Ida Pagliaro, and I'm sure others who were working behind the scenes. So I'm very, very excited to be here, with you in person after a couple of years of doing a lot of things virtually. So the talk that I'm going to be giving today stems from a project where I'm thinking about how literature can help us think about some of the problems that we confront in the era of climate change. And I think very often we imagine, or our first instinct is to think about contemporary literature as literature that's thinking about the problems of climate change, contemporary science fiction that's very directly, thematically addressing these questions. Maybe for self-interested reasons, because I'm a Victorianist who works on the 19th century, I think there's a much longer literary tradition that's useful for thinking about what it means to undergo or inhabit a moment or period of ecological crisis. So the texts that I'm going to be talking about today are from a much earlier moment in the history of industrialization when authors, readers, writers are thinking about what it means to be living in a world that's undergoing rapid transformation, and where those transformations are specifically linked to the excavation, the extraction of fossil fuels that are known to have taken hundreds of millions of years to accumulate and that are being expended within the space of decades or centuries. So the title of the talk is Beyond Deep Time, Scale in the Literary Imagination. In his recent book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty writes of the strangeness of our experience of multiple timescales in the era of climate change. Chakrabarty notes that, quote, understanding what anthropogenic climate change is and how long its effects may last calls for thinking on very large and small scales at once. He goes on to say that we now find ourselves existing in three histories that operate at different scales and at different speeds. These are histories of the Earth system, so geological history, histories of the evolution of life, biological history, and histories of industrial modernity, human history. So while we previously would have been able to clearly separate the disciplines of human history and Earth history, one in the humanities, one in the sciences, we now understand that human history, human actions of carbon emissions are destroying a biosphere that's been around for tens of thousands of years, and even more remarkably, that human impacts on the Earth will be legible, will be clear for millions or hundreds of millions of years. So what we previously thought of as a distinction between human history and Earth history has begun to collapse. In order to understand this situation, we need to think on multiple scales at once. Historical events, for the first time, can now also be geological events. The name for this practice of thinking on multiple scales at once is commensurating. The historian Deborah Cohen describes commensurating or scalar commensuration as, quote, the practice of mediating between different systems of measurement, of moving from the scale of human history to the scale of species history or Earth history. To commensurate scales is to understand the interactions between, for example, millions of years of natural selection and hundreds of years of carbon emissions. In the environmental humanities, many scholars have taken up these questions about scale and about the possibility of commensurating or linking up different scales of time and space. And a very common argument about why scale is so important, the idea of scale is so important to the environmental humanities, hinges on this idea of commensuration. So none of us can directly experience the time scale of natural selection or of evolution. But what is unavailable to us as individual human beings is readily available to our imagination. So works of literature, of art, of film, cultural works can connect what we immediately experience to what we fear might happen. The cultural imagination makes present futures and pasts that we cannot ourselves see. It's with this idea, with this reasoning, that the eco-critic Ursula Heise has argued that science fiction novels representing long time spans offer models for what strategies climate narratives in the contemporary could rely on. On this argument, fiction allows for the experience of ourselves not as individual human beings locked in our limited sense of time, but rather as offer an experience of ourselves as part of a species affecting and participating in the history of life on Earth. Fiction opens up the possibility, at least imaginatively, of experiencing the multiple incommensurate timescales that historians have identified as interacting in this new and weird way in the moment of climate change. While this experience, this difficulty of reconciling different scales of time is often described as new, in fact, it's quite old. Historians of literature and science have been studying how cultural production resolves disjunctures between timescales for decades in a rich vein of work on the cultural history of geology and biology. The literary scholar Gillian Beer's landmark book, Darwin's Plots, is centrally concerned with this question of the scalar imagination. Beer explores how Charles Darwin's ideas influenced the novelist Thomas Hardy, who, Beer writes, was, quote, acutely diverse to diverse timescales, and to the extent to which the oblivious interaction of these differing scales makes up the mesh of event and experience. Indeed, as Beer reflects on how Thomas Hardy's characters confront their unimportance to the natural world, she suggests that the experience of incommensurate timescales of these different scales is an experience of pain. Within Hardy's novels, she writes, the most fortunate creatures are those which dwell entirely within a single timescale, but our habitual experience is of multiple time, which brings with it the incommensurate. So Gillian Beer, in her work on Darwin and Hardy, writing before scholarship on climate change, is already thinking about how these disjunctures between different timescales, the fact that we're not limited to one timescale, produces a kind of sense of pain or a sense of being out of joint with the world. Returning to Beer's work today, it's interesting to see how accurately her account of Hardy and Darwin anticipates recent discussions of the role of literature in the time of climate change, which in work that uses the same language of incommensuration and scalar multiplicity. In part, this resonance between her work and contemporary work on climate change is due to the fact that the incommensurate timescales that Thomas Hardy addressed were not just new histories of Earth and species that were outlined by Charles Lyell and Darwin, but also the time scale of a fossil-fueled industrial modernity that Hardy recognized as operating at a different rate than the cyclical patterns of rural life. The literary project of commensurating the conflicting scales of industrialization, species history, and Earth history doesn't arise for the first time in the moment of climate change in the last 20 years, but extends into the 19th century as these questions are seen for the first time. In this talk, I want to explore how 19th century literary texts, particularly works of speculative and science fiction, tried to commensurate divergent scales of time. What I'll suggest is that the challenge that arises in the attempt to commensurate or to make timescales line up with each other is not just a quantitative issue that can be solved with numbers, of reconciling two systems of measurement, one that's done in decades and another that's done in eons or eras. I think commensuration is a lot more complex than that. The challenge of commensuration is that shifting between different timescales entails shifting between different sets of values, and therefore can't achieve this process of scalar commensuration simply through enumeration, simply through numbers. That's kind of abstract, so here's an example of what I mean. In one of Thomas Hardy's novels called A Pair of Blue Eyes, a character is looking at a cliff and reflecting on the geology of this cliff. And this makes him think about his own insignificance. And he notes that the immense lapses of time each formation represented had known nothing of the dignity of man. So for this character, within the scale of geological time registered in the arrangement of the rocks, the value or dignity we attribute to human existence is evacuated, is empty, is rendered unimportant because things matter very differently at a small scale than they do at a very large scale. What this suggests is that commensurating different scales can't be achieved by making numbers line up, but rather requires an engagement with conflicts of value that the interaction between different timescales entail. In drawing attention to this challenge that arises when we try and put two different timescales together, my goal is not to solve the questions that critics have brought up about this, this idea of multiple scales in the era of climate change, but for better or worse, simply to complicate and make even more difficult the idea of scalar commensuration that other scholars have raised. So far the topics, the question I've been talking about are questions that are big and ponderous and philosophical, approached by people like Charles Darwin and Thomas Hardy, great scientists and great novelists. But in fact, there was an entire genre of popular fiction that tried to resolve and think through these very questions by constructing narratives that, as Jules Verne's editor wrote, would, quote, recount in an entertaining and picturesque format the history of the universe. Writers of speculative fiction and utopias understood that new scientific accounts of Earth history were formulated within a society newly driven by coal and steam. So the big scale of geological time that they were pondering came up against and collided with the rapidity of modernization and this interest in what was going to happen in a quickly changing future. What interests me then about 19th century speculative fiction is that it looked both to the vast history of the Earth, the immediate future of industrial society, and the eventual fate of the human species, three very different scales of time. In Europe and in the United States, a popular subgenre of speculative fiction emerged, which I think of, I don't really have a name for this yet, but I think of it as the imaginary ethnography, in which an explorer or a time traveler is given a tour of the novelties of some undiscovered or future society, ends up in some place and has a guide who takes him around and says, this is how we do things here 1,000 years in the future, or in this hidden society in the center of the Earth. In texts like these, thinking across timescales became an avenue for social commentary on the present, a way of kind of satirizing or commenting on how society in the 19th century was arranged. Among the most famous of these types of novels are Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, William Morris's News from Nowhere, and H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. But there were many more in this genre, including Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, Samuel Butler's Erewhon, Mary Lane's Missoura, Henry Hudson's A Crystal Age, Elizabeth Corbett's New Amazonia, Edward Maitland's By and By. If you haven't heard of those novels, it's not because you're not well read, it's because nobody has read them. They've become quite obscure now. By contrast with the really eventful and exciting narratives of someone like Jules Verne, a lot of these imaginary ethnographies chose instead a dutiful kind of recounting of a strange society's behaviors and practices, interrupted only rarely by the thinnest of romance and adventure plots. While many of these were terrible novels by any literary standard, now justly forgotten, they explicitly asked how new scientific theories emerging in thermodynamics, evolution, linguistics, and geology would play out in material transformations of society. They're interesting for contemporary inquiries into scalar commensuration because they're concerned not only with big cosmic questions about the future of humanity, but with the mid-level scale of everyday life, the nature of work, of transportation, of class relations, of machinery. We can think about these novels as novels of scalar commensuration in which deep time came into contact, or sometimes conflict, with competing scales of time and value. So I'm going to talk in the rest of this talk about two of these novels in particular. One is called Erewhon, written by Samuel Butler in 1872. The other is called The Coming Race, written by Edward Bulwer Lytton in 1871. And as I was just mentioning, these novels are, they do something different than we think of novels as doing when a novel talks about deep time. So for someone like Darwin, deep time is this big, sublime, cosmic, philosophical question about the nature and future of humanity. These novels that I'm going to be talking about were more interested in something like social satire or social commentary. And they pivoted between really immediate social questions that were important to people in the 1870s and these much larger timescales. So this can make them feel really dated in a way, because a lot of the social questions they're concerned about are no longer salient to us. But I think the way that they're dated is actually kind of what's most interesting about them, because it suggests or shows how they were attached to a much smaller scale of time, one that has since passed or is no longer relevant to us. So in addition to thinking about the time scale of natural selection or evolution, they're thinking at the time scale of changing gender relations or the contemporary status of the British Empire. And finally, what I want to suggest about these novels is that while the idea or the topic of scale is a topic for these novels, is something they explicitly address, the practice of commensurating scales or making two different kinds of scales line up, that practice becomes an aspect of their form or an aspect of genre, so that this process of making scales line up isn't one just that characters talk about and think about, but that it's built into how this genre, the imaginary ethnography, works. I'm going to get my water. So I'll start by talking about Samuel Butler's 1872 novel, Erewhon, or Over the Range. This novel describes a colonist named Higgs who travels to a very New Zealand-like place that's not New Zealand in search of land so that he can raise sheep and export wool back to the textile mills of Britain. So implicitly with this premise, we're clearly in the British world of global industrialization fueled by coal and steam. Unfortunately for Higgs, it turns out that all of the best land has already been stolen by other settlers, and so he goes on an expedition to find some sheep farming land for himself. On this expedition, he finds a lost society called Erewhon that surprisingly has banned modern technology, including steam engines and even watches. The novel goes on to give readers a tour of this upside-down society, as each chapter details some strange belief or another held by Erewhonians. So, for example, potatoes are regarded as sentient, intentional beings. Babies are scolded for having made the poor decision to be born. Illness is a crime prosecuted by lawyers, while stealing is an illness treated by doctors. At one point, a judge reprimanded someone who has committed the crime of falling ill, telling this person that they're guilty of being sick. The judge says, whether your being in a consumption is your fault or no, it is a fault in you, and it is my duty to see that against such faults as this, the Commonwealth shall be protected. These strange practices and belief systems are accounted for by the society's prevalent evolutionary theory, which fears that natural selection will lead machines to evolve artificial intelligence, which would then subjugate human beings, and similarly views illness in this same context of natural selection. This is one of I think the first novel that imagines the evolution of artificial intelligence. So for the characters who live in this world of Erewhon, the time scale of evolution of natural selection is not some abstract idea, not some remote possibility, but an ever-present threat that structures their everyday life. So where Julian Beer observes that our habitual experience is of multiple time, which brings with it the incommensurate, instead, in this world that Butler describes, we see a society where multiple scales have commensurated or lined up. The scale of natural selection, the scale of everyday life, these are operating entirely at the same level. So what Butler's novel does is explore what happens when you make an evolutionary timescale the basis of a legal and a social system. Both the novel's fear of machine intelligence and its erasure of individual will stem from Butler's engagement with evolutionary theory in the 1870s, and specifically with his espousal of Lamarckian evolutionary theory, which argued against Darwin that acquired habits could be passed down on to offspring. Butler had written a book called Life and Habit, where he argued that individual mind and character, the kind of things that make you who you are already determined in the embryo that will later become a person. In that book, he writes, it would seem probable that all of our mental powers must go through a quasi-embryological condition, and all the qualities of human thought and character are to be found in embryo, or in other words, that individual behavior is biologically determined by the history of one's lineage. So any habit that you have, any kind of aspect of your personality, that's something that has been a habit that your ancestors had and they have passed down onto you. In Erewhon, in this novel, Butler imagines an indigenous society that's ordered its laws around this kind of idea, such that the scale of deep time and the scale of human time are operating in the same level. A tendency towards crime is an illness, a biological defect that might be passed down and hence needs to be treated by doctors rather than punished by judges. Thus far, the novel imagines a really kind of perfect commensuration of the timescale of natural selection, the timescale of social existence. But what's interesting is that its frame narrative, which I mentioned briefly, having to do with colonialism, introduces a wrinkle into this idea by placing an evolutionary timescale within another timescale, the scale of civilizational progress that was espoused by some Victorian anthropologists. The anthropologist Edward Tyler wrote in a landmark book of anthropology called Primitive Culture, published 1 year before Erewhon, that there is, quote, a definite line along which to reckon progression and retrogression in civilization. So civilizations exist on a scale of progress. Some are have progressed more than others, and this is a linear scale that can be used to measure societies. The concluding chapter of Erewhon satirizes this idea of civilization's timescale. Higgs, after he's escaped from Erewhon and come back to publish this book, invites his readers to invest in a company that will buy gunboats to capture the Erewhonians and inter them in Christian labor camps, harvesting sugarcane, such that the investors in this scheme will be, quote, saving souls and filling their pockets at the very same moment. Butler thus ensconces the scale of evolutionary time within a scale of British imperialist ideology. The Erewhonians' ability to commensurate contemporary society with deep time, their making evolution the central principle of their society, is portrayed by the novel as an indigenous practice of a backward society, which then renders Erewhonians vulnerable to the advanced technology of British colonialism. Effectively, then, the novel illustrates how the practice of commensurating scales doesn't simply involve jumping from one unit of time to another. Instead, it suggests that scalar commensuration is a more complex process of understanding the interaction between values implied by different kinds of scales. So we see in Erewhon not only the scale of time defined by evolution or defined by social progress, but also the ideological imperialist scale of civilizational progress that frames the narrative. And these are two scales that can't be quantitatively lined up with one another because they're simply scales of different kind. When Butler's novel was published, it was immediately recognized as an example of a new kind of fictional genre that took recent theories in the sciences and social sciences as the basis for speculation about imaginary societies elsewhere or in the future. In fact, its story was so similar to another novel that had just been published called The Coming Race that many readers thought that Erewhon was a sequel to The Coming Race and read it for that reason. This actually made Butler kind of angry and frustrated because he had published anonymously. His name wasn't on the book. So he then said, no, I wrote Erewhon. This is my book. And people stopped buying it. So kind of rubbed salt in the wound. The Westminster Review, commenting on kind of this phenomenon of all these books coming out, said that all of these books owe their origin really and truly to Darwinism. The development theory has set a train of speculation afloat, which has found a voice in romance. So this idea that Darwinian theory has created a new kind of fictional genre. Scholars of science fiction and utopia have since described this genre in various ways, as social dreams, allegorical pilgrimage, satirical utopia. There are a lot of different names for describing this kind of new genre of fiction. I would simply observe that in part, it arises out of this problem of commensurating the various timescales available for viewing the world in this moment, which seemed to need new fictional techniques to navigate them. So the coming race. The coming race almost exactly flips the relation between evolutionary time and cultural value that Butler describes in Erewhon. So in the coming race, we find ourselves not in New Zealand, but rather deep inside the Earth, where a hidden civilization has evolved to biologically master an immensely destructive and powerful electrical force called vril. The narrator learns that these beings that he's discovered inside the Earth, called vril ya, evolved from pre-human frogs, have progressed beyond their primitive reliance on steam and gas for energy, and have finally, quote, arrived at the unity of natural energetic agencies that allows them to directly connect their nervous system to force fields of energy. So it makes sense that readers thought this was a sequel to Erewhon, because it's almost the exact opposite. Instead of the Erewhonians who have banned technology, the Vrilya have embraced a kind of technological natural selection, becoming themselves highly evolved cyborgs, hybrids of biological matter and invisible electric force. Much like Erewhon, the coming race uses an evolutionary timescale to explain particular features of its society. So the evolution of vril power, for example, explains why this is a perfectly equal society. Perfect absolute class and gender equality exists because any vril person could destroy any other vril person immediately. There's a kind of nuclear, mutually assured destruction and has resulted in perfect peace within the society. What this logic does is conflate advances or conflate developments in biological natural selection with social change. So the changes that produce a different kind of biological organism also produce a different political system. And in fact, the Vrilya think of democracy as a previous stage of development and have no qualms about destroying lesser beings that engage in democracy when they settle in a new region and find them. So the thread of the novel, as readers are reading it in the 1870s, is that these Vrilya hidden beneath the earth might someday emerge and destroy the inferior human species. And in fact, one contemporary reviewer who was describing this novel explicitly mentioned that this threat that the novel suggests, this threat of extermination, was that which had in fact taken place at the hands of English colonists in America and New Zealand. By interweaving large-scale narratives of imperialism, social progress, natural selection, the novel illustrates not only that scales of time aren't neutral, so time scales involve certain sets of values, but also that the commensuration of different timescales, making two timescales line up with one another, can naturalize claims about differences within society and between cultures. So making the scale of evolutionary time the same as the scale of political change makes political change seem as though it's as natural selection. This is in fact a thought experiment that H.G. Wells would later borrow for The Time Machine, when he explored how natural selection and political life could be thought of not as separate spheres of human existence, one studied by biologists and the other studied by social scientists. Instead, along a time scale, they're mutually determinative, such that in The Time Machine, the working class evolve into the Morlocks under the earth, and the leisure class evolve into the Eloi living above the earth. One thing that these novels teach us about the project of making different timescales line up with each other is that this process of commensuration needs to be solved at the level of the novel form and not just treated as an object of inquiry by the characters, the narrators. So here I want to get to a little bit why these are such boring novels, and suggest that the boringness of these novels is in fact part of what makes them work as novels about scale and making scales connect. One reviewer described The Coming Race pejoratively as, quote, only a slender thread of a story that is used merely for stringing together opinions and speculations about ordinary life and thought, past, present, and future. But what sounds like a bug can actually be understood as a feature of this new hybrid genre of fiction and social theory. In under 200 pages, The Coming Race roams from Faraday to Darwin to Max Muller to gender relations to imperialism and democratic theory. Erewhon, News from Nowhere, Looking Backward, all these novels are similarly capacious in their social and scientific theorizing. In order to maintain this scope, writers of speculative fiction needed a mode of narration that would allow for the commensuration of local phenomena that surprised the imaginary tourist narrator with the more speculative pasts and futures that had given rise to them. At one typical moment in The Coming Race, one of the Vrilya uses her power, quote, to put in movement large and weighty substances. She seemed to endow them with intelligence and to make them comprehend and obey her command. So this character is moving rocks around simply by waving her hands. This, of course, shocks the narrator, who asks how this works. And the character, instead of explaining the kind of technical process of making stuff move around this way, gives a history of her species. She explains that the nerve in her hand that allows her to control matter has been slowly developed in the course of generations, increasing with the continuous exercise of the vril power. Therefore, in the course of 1,000 or 2,000 years, such a nerve might possibly be engendered in those higher beings of your race. So in this moment, which is very characteristic of this genre, something really surprising happens. A character is like moving rocks around. And this event is generalized or explained through its relationship to a very large timescale of thousands of years. This explanatory technique, which toggles between an astonishing immediate event and a very long historical narrative, recurs across speculative fiction in this moment, becoming not just a trope, but even, I would say, a marker of genre, a style of writing that makes this genre what it is. It's this quality that the contemporary narrator reviewer objected to when they said that The Coming Race was plotless, that it has just this very thin series of events. Narrative within these novels takes place at what I would describe as a mid-level scale, a scale that's continually describing generalities, things as they generally are, much more than particular events. Science fiction is a genre that we often think of as coming up with ways of narrating immense, vast scales of time. This is what Ursula Heise has in mind when she says that science fiction representing long time spans gives us models for what strategies climate change narratives right now could rely on. But I don't think it's actually the representation of long time spans that's innovative about these texts, but rather this mediating mid-level, even kind of middle brow function that's a much more interesting innovation of the genre, the ability to toggle between the immediate and the general and the vast. It's not that speculative ethnographies opened up the vastness of historical time, but that they allowed readers to see how biological or geological time would affect a mid-level conception of social and political life, how it would affect things as they generally are, somewhere in between the specificity of individual experience and the vastness of geological time. And I think in recent scholarship about scale and climate change in the novel form, it's this mid-level scale that often gets left out as people are much more interested in the most vast possible narratives about what science fiction can do. The novels that I've been describing placed big sweeps of time in relation to very specific national and imperial histories of colonialism, gender relations, mining, sheep farming, and so forth. They allowed for asking questions about humanity's place in new timescales, not with a view to some idea of a universal humanity or humanity as a general category. Instead, within these novels, the human is framed as a mid-level category, internally differentiated with different kinds of humans. So I'll close by returning to the question that I began with about scalar commensuration, about this process of making that Dipesh Chakraborty talks about, of how we're at three different scales right now: the historical, the biological, and the geological. When Chakrabarty argues that climate change places us at the intersection of these three scales that we haven't usually had to think about together, it's easy to think about scale in that sentence as a sort of timeline. Imagine the geological time scale that you may have seen in a science class. It's easy to think about this timeline as one that we can seamlessly zoom in and out on to see more or less as we desire. From this point of view, the challenge of commensurating different scales is much like figuring out a new camera, twisting the lens to get closer or farther away from the object that you want to see. But when we turn to literary texts that tried to grapple with the multiple practices and types of scaling that emerged within a society whose rapid industrialization depended on ancient stores of coal, we see a more complicated picture. Scalar commensuration is not a problem of zooming, but rather a problem of leaping. That is, of leaping over the gap that separates a scale that measures social progress from a scale that measures biological change over time. Not only in Erewhon and The Coming Race, but in a wide range of other imaginary ethnographies, this leap could be either exposed and critiqued, as Erewhon does when it gives a detailed explanation of the evolution of artificial intelligence, or this leap could be naturalized, as The Coming Race does when it proposes that the supposedly advanced society of the 19th century was in fact tenuously primitive. It was at least partially through innovations of literary genre and form in the rise of speculative fiction that these problems of scalar commensuration were made available to thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morgan, for that rich and fascinating lecture. We'll take questions and see what people have to ask. I think as people think, I might actually ask the first question, which is just to offer you an invitation or an opportunity to dilate on a topic of your own research in relation to this topic, which is the topic of decadence. And so thinking about these two novels a bit before Decadence, Oscar Wilde and company come around, do you see these as setting up the research you've discussed, where you talk about the idea of a decadent planet being aligned with a decadent writer or aesthetics as a human body, and even a decadent species, maybe a degenerating evolutionary species rather than progressing one? Or do you locate these two earlier works in a different tradition than, say, something later at the end of the century?
That's a good question. I think I don't know yet. My instinct is to say that, so within decadent texts, they often do the kind of large-scale thinking that I was describing, where they're thinking about the end of the planet. So what happens when the energy in the sun runs out, or the end of empires, the kind of decadence arises partly out of this fear that biological organisms are going to evolve to become less complex rather than more complex, and that the human species will degenerate. And I think all of that thought is framed at a very kind of high-level universal concept of the species or the human. And partly in writing this talk, I think what I began to find really interesting was how you could think at a smaller level. So it's really tempting always to go to this big, sublime, like, oh my God, what is going to happen to the human species? And it's a lot harder, I think, to think at this level where you're thinking about society as we experience it at a mundane, everyday kind of level, but also keeping in mind these bigger questions. And I think that's kind of what these novels are doing that really interested me, and that I was partly able to figure out by thinking through this talk. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk, first of all. And I was thinking about, like, when you were talking about the idea of scalar commensuration, like, I thought it was pretty sick that instead of looking at it as like a timeline, it's more like layers. So you have to address them, like there's like three buckets you were mentioning, like the geological, the biological, and human progress. And like it made me think, like, do you believe that, like as we're trying to solve issues, about climate change today, we have to like, consider the values maybe of people who live like 100, 200 years like ahead, how much do you think that we have to consider things like that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question that. Sorry, oh, sorry. Repeat the question. Okay, so I need to repeat questions for people that don't have microphones. So the question had to do with the kind of three buckets of thinking about different timescales of evolutionary time, geological time, and human historical time, and how these imply different values. And do we need to be thinking about, as we're thinking through this question of climate change, the values of people 100, 200 years from now? Is that a fair? Yeah. So I think that's exactly the question of scale that is really tricky to figure out when you're trying to make problems that are occurring at this geological time scale, where like mass extinction is happening, the ocean is running out of fish, these kinds of like huge problems, and then play those out at scales that we live in political time, which are scales of, maybe 4 years or 10 years, or, it's really hard to think about how we act in a way that is most conducive to people who are going to be around 100 years from now, because we have a really hard time acting in ways that are conducive or helpful for people who are around right now. So I think that for when Chakrabarty and other historians are thinking about this problem of scale, that's exactly that's one of the really contentious and difficult questions of scale or commensuration, is how do you have how do you produce a society, or how do you produce a collective that acts in the best interest of people who aren't around yet? Yeah, so I think that's very much the political version of that question.
Great question. We have a question coming in from online. It's about one of my favorite topics, cognitive estrangement. So Darko Suvin famously writes that science fiction is the mutation of scientific into aesthetic forms of cognition. Although Suvin directs this claim at the work of H.G. Wells, it can assuredly be applied more broadly to late Victorian science fiction. What kind of aesthetic innovations do you see as essential to this project, be they on the level of plot, narrative, or other aspects? You mentioned scale as one, but textually, how is this scaling achieved, say, formally or aesthetically?
Yeah, so I think the aesthetic innovation that that really interests me is, so the quote there was the transmutation of scientific thought into aesthetics. And I think I would just modulate that a little bit for these texts to think about the transmutation of social scientific thought into aesthetics. So all of these texts, or a lot of these texts that I'm interested in, are taking social theories and trying to turn them into narratives, where H.G. Wells or Jules Verne would be more likely to take scientific, pure, like hard geological, biological scientific theories and turn them into narrative. And I think that that is kind of a formal innovation, where you're taking a description or account of gender relations in a society and then trying to use that to produce a work of science fiction. You end up, at least in these texts, with kind of like a boring, it feels a little bit like a textbook of a sociological textbook of a society that doesn't exist. And that is not a plot. That's a kind of like series of descriptions. So like that, I think that's the aesthetic innovation. It's not like necessarily a good one, but it's an interesting one.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi. So all your discussion of this commensuration, to me you describe it as rather boring, but I could see it in another way as being kind of fearful almost. Like I'm thinking of like H.P. Lovecraft's like discussion of like weird fiction.
Yeah.
And how we might see as this like turn towards a more materialist culture and away from like the gothic and the ghostly that comes before it. So I don't know if you see that intersection as well. Like is that something?
Yeah, so the question, I'll just repeat the question. The question was that I had described commensuration in these texts as kind of a boring practice, but it could be also a fearful practice, or something that inspires fear, as for example in the works of H.P. Lovecraft and weird fiction. Yeah, there's a great, I think I would want to think a little bit about, there are like 4 directions I want to go here. I think, so one thing to think about is the concept of the sublime or sublimity, and the idea that something that is very vast or something that's immense overpowers our capacity to apprehend it or to see it, and then that's a painful experience. So this goes back to Burke and Kant and Enlightenment aesthetics, and I think that the sublimity is a concept of scale. It's a concept of something so big that you can't see it. And I think that is that kind of, that unknown quality, something that's so large or so unknown that you can't see it, inspiring fear or terror, is an analog, is very much a version of an aesthetic effect of scaling. But I think it would be more along the lines of what the decadent writers later in the century were interested in than some of these like utopian or social theorizing writers. So I think you're absolutely right to think of Lovecraft as someone who would be doing that.
Yeah, and maybe we can move from horror to another question that's come in online. This one is a question of reflection. The literary appropriation of scientific theory and scientific discovery begins in the 29th century and earlier than the early 1870s. I'm thinking, for example, of an essay by I forget who that I read 50 years ago about Bleak House, an essay titled From Faraday to Judgment Day. Please comment. And oh, sorry, it was supposed to be obviously 19th century, not 29th. You don't know when it's science fiction.
Yeah, right. I know.
So, yeah.
So could you clarify, was the question about that this is happening earlier than in the 1870s, there are precedents to?
Yeah, let me recapitulate.
Yeah.
So just the idea that the literary appropriation of scientific theory and discovery begins in the 19th century, like so far earlier than this period, right, of the early 1870s. So, things like Bleak House and et cetera. So do you want to just talk about sort of what the sort of antecedents of this are and kind of what sets up this conversation, or what kind of allies? Clearly this isn't made de novo, right? Where does it come from?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's such a, I think that in the late 18th century, with theories of the Earth as having been around for much longer than was imagined within the biblical imagination, but not permanent, as was imagined by Aristotle and the ancients, produces a kind of like a literary ferment or an interest in responding to that kind of new geological theory. And then I think Darwin is kind of the next moment with the idea of natural selection and evolution that produces, for Hardy, who is also writing a little bit earlier than some of these writers. So I think there are absolutely uptakes, obviously, of science within the literary field long before these texts. I wouldn't absolutely say this is the first time that science is being appropriated by the literary. I think that the way that these texts are doing it in the form of this travelogue of, I think that so I'll put it this way, what interests me is how the genre of utopian writing, which had long used this kind of travelogue model, gets infected by, if that's not too strong a word, new scientific thought. So I think that the scientific romance is a name for this genre as well. I think that's what's particularly interesting in this moment. So not the newness of it per se, but the particular way that it's happening in the 1870s.
Maybe I'll ask you one more thing about then the other side of it, which I'm interested in what comes after and what you see this leading to, in the sense of this idea of the Earth system, biological history, human history, the three. Then I was thinking, is there something beyond that you get when you get to modern science fiction that might be a kind of universe model of scale? And with those kind of alien narratives or alien race narratives, how do they work differently or similarly? Like, do you see those as connected or afterlives? Or does it matter that these cultures are within the same planet, within the same Earth, but just kind of hidden, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
The common scale.
Yeah. I think, so Olaf Stapledon has a novel called First and Last Men that is written at the timescale of billions of years, and there's in fact a new film adaptation that's just barely come out. I cannot. It's voiced over by an actress whose name I can't remember. But I think it's actually really hard. Like, narrative is a human construct, and it's really hard to break narrative out of its inhuman frame, to imagine like truly inhuman universal narratives that don't fit within our methods of measuring time and space. Yeah. And so I think a lot of examples of this kind of the largest scale versions of this narrative, outer space, they tend to like reappropriate or reuse tropes that already exist within the genre. So there's kind of like, I want to say like imaginative limit to things, but there's rarely something so radically unfamiliar that you can't like see the connection between the emergence of science fiction in the 19th century.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe we have time for one last question. Yeah.
I mean, my question was very similar to that of Bob Nicholson, but it's other than climate change, can you foresee other social issues that we are sort of like starting to face today that could fit within this like lens of scale in the future, or could become something that is similar to what you discussed now?
I would invite you to answer that question. I'd be curious to know what kind of problems and social aspects we confront that would be interesting other than climate change. For me, climate change is the interesting one because it takes place at a scale that's unprecedented. So there's something radical. The fact that we're changing the Earth in ways that are going to be evident for 100 million years, no species has been able to do that before. So there is something in qualitatively different about what humans are doing right now. That in fact the only precedent, weirdly, is this organism called cyanobacteria that oxygenated the atmosphere billions of years ago. Other than us and cyanobacteria, no one has had this kind of effect on the planet. So that measures how big of a scale climate change is happening at. But to pull back from a little bit, I think what matters, or why I'm kind of doing this project, is that it's not always useful to think at that largest possible scale. In order to think through what this problem means for us, we need smaller scales. We need the capacity to move between that really large scale and the scale of our social existence. And I think that ideally for me is what literature might be able to achieve or do, is make that connection between the large and the small.
Interesting. We talked in the science fiction course at McGill about these small-scale science fiction worlds that come out of the microscope, say. So
yeah.
You're right. You can build worlds different ways, and they give you different things and affordances. So with that, I think thank you once again to everyone here and abroad for taking time out of the busy term to join us today for the 2022 Mossman Lecture. Special note of thanks goes out, of course, to the library for organizing the Mossman Lecture this year. But most importantly, we'd like to extend a huge thank you to Professor Morgan for sharing his insights with us all today. Give him a hand.
Thank you.